Hello, and welcome to Chapter 17, Top 2. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. First of all, this lovely little baby over my shoulder is Memphis Blue, and this is Bermuda's younger brother. Anyway, so he's up here today. He chased Bermuda off. Anyway, they are, we had the window open earlier and the birds were singing, and yeah, it was quite the little fight over who got to look out the window. Anyway, just on housekeeping news, it's been a year since book 2 came out. So I just feel like I wanted to say a little something about that. So currently I'm writing chapter 23, Change of Plans, and I have 174,000 words written on this book so far, and there just is not another good stopping point until I reach the end. So I'm just going to keep writing until I get to the end. So anyway, the good news is if it's audio, it just keeps going. It's all digital, so it doesn't matter. And if it is a Kindle book, then it downloads and it's ready to go. And fortunately, this is in the fantasy genre, so that means that big, thick, meaty books are appreciated and liked. So anyway, just letting you guys know it's coming along. I really appreciate you tuning in every week and leaving me all the lovely feedback and support. And the book is getting written, and it's huge. And did I tell you book 2 was 153,000 words, and book 1 was like 130? So we're way beyond book 1 and 2 territory. I really, honestly, I don't know what the final word count's going to be, but it's going to be a lot. It's going to definitely be over 200,000, maybe over 250. So I guess we'll just see. So anyway, chapter 17, top 2. So last time what we had was we were hitting up the top 4. So they were having a March Madness tournament style bracket, and we got to go and see the final of the top 4. The red and blue fighting it out. And so now we're picking up right after that match. So here we go. Now the match was over, the spectators cleared out pretty quickly, which is when I saw Eugene. He'd been right down by the ring, as close to the action as he could get. He waved and headed over. Once again, I was struck by just how much he looked like Superman. He had the same broad shoulders, square jaw, and great hair. He wasn't as good looking as Henry Cavill, but then again, who is? Eugene, I said happily, giving him a big hug. Then I introduced him to my crew. It's very nice to meet you, Sandy said graciously. Any friend of Jason is a friend of mine. What did you think of the match? Goggles inquired. I had a feeling he was more than just curious. He was probably fishing for information that would change the odds. I'm glad Red lost the last match, Eugene replied. As you saw, he is tricky, and he likes to change up his fighting style. If I were fighting him, I'd have to be a lot more cautious. Blue, on the other hand, is a better fighter, but he's more straightforward. I know what I'll be up against when I face him. He's going to bring his batons, and he's going to want to fight in close. If I can keep him at a distance, it will be an easy fight. I'd love to stay and chat some more, but I need to get ready for my next match. It's the big one where hopefully I win the division. It's going to start in an hour at Ring 3, so maybe I'll see you there? We assured him that we most certainly would be there cheering him on. He left to get ready, and we looked around for another match to watch. Spectators were already starting to gather for the title match at Ring 3, and we wanted a good view, so we decided just to go straight there and get our spot. I'm glad we did, as we were able to get one of the last spaces that was right beside the ring. We were going to have an unobstructed courtside view. We settled in to wait, and MM switched over to helpful llama mode. He took our drink orders, frou-frou for me, and left to go get some snacks. Before he left, I saw him shoot a glance at Goggles, who nodded slightly. It seemed like they were both keeping an eye out for any trouble. Sandy caught the glance, too. It's very nice to know they are watching out for us, she whispered. We sure have met some wonderful people here. Yes, we sure have, I said warmly. I'd been afraid that we would feel small and alone, but the Centaur Llama's Hyderabad, and the volunteers of House ATAC have made us feel welcome and included. It's made me proud to be part of the houses. Well, except for House Chihuka. They were dicks. So what are the odds on Eugene's match? I asked Goggles. Currently, they are 1-1, even Steven, he said. I think everyone is waiting to see how the ring is set up before laying down a real bet. We had the time, so I thought we might as well talk about the fight. I'd heard about how Eugene had trained, but I didn't know how that translated into his record in the ring. Tell me why I should bet on Eugene, I asked, skipping the obvious reason that he's my friend. Well, he is a really good, well-rounded mage, Goggles said. His main weapon is the bow, which is not that unusual, but it's his arrows that set him apart. He makes them out of magic, and he has both the flow and capacity to shoot a lot of them. There are many mages who use a bow as their ranged weapon, but they don't have the ability to fire more than a few times. A bow is actually very wasteful with magic, Sandy chimed in. Actually, most ranged weapons are. Look at all the work a mage has to do just to create an arrow. They need to focus on the form, fill it with magic, then solidify the form, all this just to get one ranged shot. Once they launch the arrow, the magic they put into it is gone, and they have to start over again for the next shot. That's why capacity and flow are so important for a ranged mage. They need the magical capacity to create arrow after arrow and still have enough magic left over to power their shield and their melee weapon. By the same token, flow is very important as well. If their flow is slow, it takes them too long to make a good arrow. I've seen starter mages spend time summoning a bow, then time summoning an arrow, and they are so slow they only get off one shot before their opponent reaches them. It's a terrible strategy for some fighters, and it's painful to watch. Lots of mages try the bow, as it's a romantic weapon, and it shows up in lots of movies and stories. It's hard to master, though, and it's only practical for a certain type of mage. But Eugene has it figured out, right? I asked. Goggles nodded. Yes, Eugene has an affinity for magical flow. He can summon his bow, summon the arrow, and get off a shot before most mages finish forming their regular weapon. That gives him a huge advantage. Many times his opponents will lose concentration on their weapon and have to start all over again. His capacity is also really good, but he's not quite as gifted in that area. He has run out of arrows before, but it doesn't happen very often. We focused on the magic side of the bow, but what really sets him apart is his accuracy rating. He hits his target 92% of the time. That is just unheard of. Most ranged fighters are only about 30% accurate. This obviously makes a big difference in stopping ability. A fighter that tries to rush him to get in close is going to be in a world of hurt. So what about his melee fighting? I asked. He switches his weapon from a bow to a staff, Goggles said. He's still rated fairly well as a melee fighter. I think most of that comes from his personal shield. It's rated very high and almost nobody gets through it. His staff technique is solid and he can put down a hurting, but it isn't exceptional. You've sold me on Eugene, I laughed. He sounds like a badass. You said the odds are even though, so do people think his opponent is just as good? Yes, that is what the odds are telling us. Goggles seemed happy, so happy, discussing this with someone who was interested. I don't think he got into fighting really, but he liked all the stats and seeing how they played out in a real match. David, his opponent in blue from the last match, is also ranked very well. His capacity is not rated as high as Eugene, but he only uses his batons, so he isn't using as much magic. His flow is also excellent, but again, not as high as Eugene. He just needs to make his batons though, so it works well for him. What sets him apart is how good he is with his weapons. He doesn't swing them around like big sticks. He works them independently, and he is equally as good at defense as offense. For the purposes of the upcoming match, the big question is, what kind of ring are they going to be fighting in? If they are fighting in an open ring, will David be able to block Eugene's arrows? If they are fighting in a mage, will Eugene's staff and shield hold up against David's excellent attacks? That is why the odds are even at the moment. Goggles finished his summary with a flourish, like he was one of those old radio shows telling us to tune in next time to hear the rest of the adventure. Sandy and I gave him an enthusiastic round of applause, but before we could discuss this any further, MM came back with our refreshments. He also came back with a few of the centaurs from the food station, and they got my autograph and we chatted for a minute. It was weird being a minor celebrity, but it wasn't bad. They just wanted to be able to say they had met me, and I was happy to make their day a little better. So, back to the match at hand, I continued after we sat down again. Do your stats say anything about the quality of their weapons? Goggles gave me a weird look, but he flipped his hand in the air for a minute, looking through the information he had. Nope, I don't see anything about weapon quality, he said. I see stuff about how fast they can summon their weapon, what weapons they've been known to summon, and if they have any morphs for it. Why, what are you seeing? Yeah, I'm curious too, Sandy chimed in. What do you mean by weapon quality? What I mean by weapon quality is how detailed are their weapons, I replied. In that last match, Blue's batons formed quickly, but they were fuzzy. I don't know this for sure, but if I had to guess, he put a lot more energy in them than they could handle. Red, on the other hand, had a lot more detail in his weapon, and the point of his spear was sharp. I'm thinking that if he'd been able to put more power in it, it could have done a lot more damage. That is an interesting observation, young mage, Goggles said. I don't see anything in my stats that would correlate to that. You have to understand, these stats and insights are really guesses and observations from professional supernaturals who watch the fights. It's not like there's a standardized test that participants have to make. Sometimes they share information about their capabilities freely in interviews, but even then, they might be over or understating what they can do. We can only see who beats who and by how much. Then we have a feel for how they stack up against other fighters. That explains a lot, I said. I was wondering how you got all your data. So someone like me, who has never fought in a tournament, would be a total unknown. That is correct, Goggles confirmed. We wouldn't start to rank you until you've had at least 5 matches. Then we could start to get a feel for how you compare to others at your age. I don't want to get away from your original question, Sandy said. When I was doing the tournament circuit, it was well known that a fighter wanted to be as familiar with their weapon as possible. It wasn't enough for them just to create something like a sword. They needed to know how to use it and how to use it well. If they created a rapier, they needed to know how to thrust with the weapon and keep their movement fast and light. It's crappy for blocking attacks, but very good at fast strikes. If they created a two-handed sword, like a claymore, then they would have reach and defense, but it's not exactly a fast weapon. That always made sense to me, and I don't recall anyone specifically talking about the detail in a weapon. I thought about saying more, but I didn't know how to do that without talking about my little creations. They needed to remain a secret, so I wasn't exactly going into all the fun touches. They needed to remain a secret, so I couldn't exactly get into all the little fun touches I gave them to make them better at their tasks. I decided to just drop it for now and talk to Sandy about it later when we were back at Louisville. Time to change the subject. So what was your weapon? I asked her. Did you rock a dual sword combo? Fire, she said simply. Like a flaming sword? I asked. I was having trouble imagining exactly what that would look like. No, she said. I used actual fire. I'd set their shields and weapons on fire. I added magic to it so it did extra damage, but I found that was extremely effective. It was very hard for my opponent to concentrate when their shield went up in flames. I looked at her in shock. I'm sure it was very distracting. No wonder she hadn't lost very often. Mana Fire burns the forms we force magic into and sets it free. That's why it was so effective against the acid that was eating away at our house shields. If you remember that, Jason, from when Isabel and the other mages attacked. I certainly did remember. That's when I'd had my first real experience with the house. It had lifted me out of my broken body at the time and let me see the entire battle from a rooftop perspective. So what did you use for defense? I asked. Take Eugene, for example. How would you handle him? For defense, I'd use fire to destroy their weapons. If I couldn't break it down fast enough, I tried dodging or even running away. I didn't need to get close for my fire to work. With Eugene, it would be an interesting battle. If he could form his arrows and shoot them before I could set them on fire, then I'd have a very hard time dealing with him. Since he's so incredibly accurate, there was a good chance he'd be able to shoot me down before I could burn through his shield. I could handle David and his batons with no problem, but Eugene could be a really difficult fight for me. The spectators were filling in, and we had a pretty big crowd, at least a couple thousand people. This was going to be a well-attended final match. I was looking forward to seeing Eugene fight, and I hoped all the time with his juicy weapon paid off for him. Goggles wanted us to enjoy the show as much as possible, so he wouldn't rest until we had all bet. MM said he didn't have much, so he bet 5 millipearls on Eugene. Sandy said she didn't like to wager, but finally bet a pearl after Goggles convinced her it was the right thing to do. I had lots of pearls now, but I didn't want to look too crazy after seeing what the others had put up, so I just put up 10 pearls. It was a lot compared to their bets, so I felt like I was supporting Eugene, but it wasn't anything I couldn't afford to lose. MM had been quiet most of the time, and I wanted to make sure he felt included in our group, so I asked how being a new supernatural was going. He said it didn't feel real yet. Right now his job was to spend time with us and make sure we were okay and there wasn't any other poisoning accidents. Once the gathering was over, he wasn't sure. The guard had suggested that he would be more than welcome with them, but that didn't feel right. He wanted to travel and see the world. Plus, he was still taking care of his grandmother, and he didn't want to leave her. I made a mental note to talk to him later about his grandmother. She was as vital to his emotional well-being as CL was to NL. I wanted to make sure she was healthy and see if she was a candidate for the shrine. The conversation had already moved on at that point, so I made a mental note and stuck a pin in it to bring it up later. Meanwhile, the other matches finished up and no new matches started. All the focus in the room was going to be on Eugene and David's match. The crowd swelled in size, and we were soon too packed in to go anywhere and get more snacks. Goggles was a great storyteller, and he kept us entertained with stories of wagers that had gone horribly wrong, or ones that should have gone wrong but somehow turned out in the best way possible. Suddenly the crowd perked up and started paying attention. We couldn't see anything, so we got to our feet and still couldn't see anything attention-worthy. Then MM spotted the crowd shifting, and a few moments later, the two contestants, the announcer, the referee, and the mage started winding their way in towards the ring. The crowd broke out in cheers and applause as excitement filled the air. The tournament was getting ready to crown its first champion. Once again, the announcer wasn't speaking in English, but it was pretty easy to follow along. He introduced David first, and our crew clapped politely. The crowd was pretty enthusiastic, though, so he might have been the fan favorite. Then he introduced Eugene, and we went wild. We hooted and hollered, and both centaurs gave their warbling war cries. Eugene had his game face on, but when he heard us, he got a big smile and waved. Next, they met in the center for the tossing of the chips. The crowd turned quiet as the announcer tossed the discs for the weapons. David was the blue player again, and Eugene was red. The disc landed blue side up. David spoke to the announcer, and the symbol for an empty hand flashed in the air. The crowd murmured a bit, but nobody seemed surprised. They will be fighting with only their own magic, Sandy said. I'd only seen one match, so I guess she wanted to make sure I remembered what the options were. So far, so good, Goggles said. That was the expected choice. Next, the announcer held up the disc with the square. It was time to determine the really important option, the ring. This was the one, or the type of ring. This was the one Eugene needed to win. The crowd got really quiet this time. It was tossed into the air and landed red side up. The announcer spoke to Eugene, and an open square appeared in the air. The crowd got much louder, and I saw a lot of mages making motions in the air. Looks like everyone is getting in their last-minute bets. Goggles chuckled happily. As expected, the odds are definitely breaking in Eugene's favor. Let's see. He paused, staring in the air for a moment. We have 4-3, 5-3, and it looks like that's where it's going to stay. I must say I'm surprised. I thought it would shift more than that. He shrugged. I guess there are a lot of people who like David more than Eugene. Or possibly David has some heavy hitters in his corner. Either way, this is going to be a good fight. The announcer held up a disc with the outline of a drop of blood on it. The crowd didn't even get quiet, as it seemed like nobody was paying attention. He tossed it in the air and it landed blue side up. David spoke to the announcer and a fist symbol appeared in the air. He's chosen the knockout option, Sandy stated, again, as expected. Would anyone like to change their wagers? Goggles asked hopefully, but we all shook our heads. Both contestants went back to their corners of the ring, and the announcer stepped out. His part was complete. And I noticed that David had a much bigger group supporting him. He had at least his whole house supporting him, and probably several more than that. Eugene, in contrast, had one person he was talking with. David's corner was loud, enthusiastic, and encouraging. Eugene's corner was quiet and serious. They seemed to be talking a bit of strategy, but the guy didn't seem to be that excited. That just struck me as a bit sad. I knew Eugene was socially awkward, but he had done very well in the tournament, and he deserved a lot more support from his house than this pitiful showing. His training had obviously worked, as he was here in the finals, but I'd rate his teacher very low on the encouragement scale. Ring up, the referee called, and the mage stepped forward and started setting it up. Once again, glowing lines traced the outline of the ring, and then climbed up from the corners and formed another square about 20 feet in the air. Once the cube outlined, the walls snapped into place. This time there wasn't anything extra to add in the middle. It was just one giant empty cube. The top of the cube was a lot higher than last time, but I wasn't sure why. Maybe Eugene had requested it? Maybe to give it more space for his arrows? The ring grew brighter, and the lights dimmed over the spectators. Anticipation built in the air as both contestants rolled their shoulders and flexed their muscles. They stayed loose, blood moving, bodies warmed up and ready for explosive action. Both of them had their game faces on. This was it. They both wanted the championship, but only one could have it. The referee stepped into the ring and called both contestants to the center. He said his piece about having a good, clean fight, and then they returned to their corners. He looked to Eugene and he nodded. He was ready. He looked at David and got the nod. He was ready too. Fight, the referee commanded, and it was on. David dropped to the ground and began summoning his batons. I thought this was smart, as it presented the smallest possible target for a ranged attack. I looked over at Eugene, and he'd already summoned his bow. That was fast. He loaded an arrow and shot it in the air before David was even half finished with his batons. It was strange because the arrow wasn't aimed directly at David. It almost seemed to be traveling at a lazy sort of speed. When it reached the height of its arc, it split into two, then split again and again. Suddenly, 16 smaller arrows were arcing down towards David. His strategy of getting on the ground didn't look as brilliant anymore. He rolled into a ball to minimize his impact area, but several of the arrows still struck at his shield. The little arrows weren't as big or powerful as the single arrow had been, but still, a hit was a hit. There was something about the trajectory that bugged me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Regardless, Eugene already had a second arrow in the air. David knew what was coming as it started to split and fall towards him again. He rolled to his feet and started dashing away from where they were going to land. I noticed in all this excitement, David wasn't growing his batons. He was too focused on evasion. He needed to get them to full strength if he was going to have a chance. David and probably everyone else in the crowd was so focused on the split arrows, they missed Eugene's next attack. He formed an arrow even denser and quicker than before and shot it down low. This time there was nothing lazy about it. It was really fast and it streaked through the air. The amazing thing was it almost hit the floor, but it curved. The arrow skimmed about an inch above the ground, then curved back up to hit David on the knee. Holy crap, Eugene could guide his arrows. No wonder his accuracy rate was so high. I'm sure it had limits. I doubt he could make it do a right turn. But he could curve them a bit, and that would make them very hard to dodge. Plus, it looked like he could control the speed a bit as well. A slow arrow could throw off an opponent's timing just as much as a fast arrow. David still had his shield up, so the hit to his knee didn't do any physical damage, but it threw him off balance and he crashed into the wall. As quick as lightning, Eugene shot 3 fast arrows at him. They all landed and the last one depleted his shield charm. It disappeared with the pop, and David got a panicked look on his face. He now had no shield and his batons weren't fully formed yet. He was in deep trouble, but Eugene wasn't going to give him time to recover. Eugene shot another slow frag arrow in the air, then another, then another. The whole back wall was going to get peppered with small arrows, and David knew it. I'm sure he wanted to dodge, but there wasn't a good area to dodge to, and he ended up doing the worst thing possible. He froze. And Eugene ate him up. Eugene shot 2 more ground speed arrows, and both of them hit David in his right leg. David's mobility was now toast, but it didn't matter as Eugene shot him in both of his shoulders. The little bit of energy that David had put into his batons winked out. Eugene was firing into David's left leg when he hollered, "Yield!" Then he fell to the ground, tapped out, and yielded a few more times just to make sure Eugene stopped. The crowd was stunned. The fight had barely started, and now it was over. Then the events caught up to everyone, and the crowd roared in approval. Eugene had just delivered a masterclass in range tactics. The referee ran over to check on David, and then put his hand on the wall of the ring, and pulled a few of his supporters through. They ran over and started working on David, who was lying groaning on the ground. The referee went over to Eugene, grabbed his wrist, and raised his hand in the air. "Winner by knockout," he hollered, and the crowd went wild. They had their champion, and a worthy one he was too. We jumped and yelled and had a wonderful time celebrating his victory. The walls went down, and lots of mages went over to offer their congratulations. This was a big moment, but all too soon the other ring started up, and the tournament continued. Eugene thanked his last well-wisher and then came over to hang with us. We made a big fuss of him and gave him lots of high fives and victory hugs. MM gave him a special winner's beer in a glass that had a blue ribbon and a number 1 on it. It kind of looked like it was more for a hog at a country fair, but it was the thought that counted. "I know you just won, so do you have to go somewhere and get a trophy or something?" I asked. He shook his head. "There is a special ceremony at the end of the tournament where they hand out prizes and awards for all the categories." "How about your house?" I asked. "Do you need to go do anything with them?" I was trying to tactfully ask where the rest of his house was without making it seem like a big deal. If he was upset that they weren't there, I didn't want to make it worse. Again, he shook his head. "Nope, I'm clear for the evening," he said. "I'm the youngest in our group, so I'm the only one fighting tonight. The rest of the house will start their matches tomorrow, so they are doing last-minute prep for that." He tried to sound unconcerned, but I got the feeling he really didn't want to be on his own right now. He just won his division, and he wasn't ready to come down from that high yet. "Would you like to spend the evening with us?" I'd asked. "We'd love to have you. Plus, we get to be famous by association. We're hanging out with the champion." I was laying it on a bit thick, but he looked happy and relieved, and he graciously accepted. The rest of the evening was a lot of fun. Nobody tried to kill us or poison our drinks, or if they did, MM took care of it before we even knew about it. We bounced from match to match, and I got to see lots of different fighting styles. I learned a lot, and my view of what was possible in a fight expanded significantly. Up to this point, I'd been fighting golems or power-crazy mages who were heavy on power but very light on technique. In fact, the only thing they really did was throw around balls of power and look like zombies. This bracket of the tournament was for mages between 100 and 200 years old. They seemed to be light on power but heavy on technique. They didn't have as much to work with as the crazy mage in the park, but they sure had a lot more skill. I saw axes of all types, I saw swords of all types, clubs, axes, spears, flails, and whips. I saw a few weird combination of weapons, and one person even tried to fight with a Jedi lightsaber that was a sword on one end and an axe on the other. On the range side, I saw fireballs, a cone of swirling ice that hunted opponents down, bows, crossbows, throwing stars, and even a boomerang. The boomerang was surprisingly effective. It was magic efficient, and he'd figured out how to bounce it off walls for angled attacks. You know, I think you could already handle most of the mages in the next bracket, I told Eugene. Your speed and accuracy would take some of these fighting styles apart. I agree, Sandy chimed in. I can't wait to see how you do at the next gathering when you're in this group. You might not win, but I think you'll get top 8, or even top 4. Thank you both very much, Eugene said sincerely, and he laughed. I've been thinking the same thing, but I didn't want to say anything in case it sounded like I had a big ego. Well, you just won, so you're allowed to have a big head for a little while at least, I said jokingly. I've been meaning to ask, can you summon your bow for me? I was looking at David at the start of the fight, and by the time I looked back to you, you were ready to shoot. Sure, he said, and held out his hand like he was holding the shaft. A thick core of magic formed in his hand, and then it grew out the top and bottom of his hand at the same time. It wasn't instantaneous, but it formed really quickly. It was about as long as it took me to say 1001, which is slightly longer than a second. I've never been this close to a magic weapon before, I said. I know everyone has their secrets, but do you mind if I examine it? You don't have your own weapon, he said in surprise. Then he seemed to realize who he was talking to, and he quickly looked apologetic. I'm sorry. You're learning this all so quickly, I forget you're a spark. Of course you can check out my bow. I felt a bit of a naughty undertone, like I was asking to examine his Winky, but this seemed like the wrong time to make a joke, so I just let it go. I let my magic sight take over, and I quickly saw that all of Eugene's time with his weapon had really paid off. I'd thought making love to his bow every day was some sort of frat boy prank, but he did have a lot of detail in his weapon, at least compared to what I could see from the other fighters tonight. His detail and magic were densest where he held the bow. That made sense, as was probably the area he paid the closest attention to. The next best areas were the ends of the bow where the strings attached. That made sense too. If he'd started with the real bow, I'm sure his teacher would have made him string and unstring his bow over and over again to get proficient with it. The limbs of the bow were the softest. The magic was sparse, and the outline was a bit fuzzy. If you put too much magic in this area, it would start to leak. It answered the main question I had, which was, how did his detail and power compare to my little creations? The answer? It didn't. My miners and grandmothers were a lot more detailed and held more power in the same amount of space. That made me feel good for some reason. So what kind of weapon do you think you'll start with? He asked. I realized I'd just been standing there staring at his bow for a few minutes. Sandy was used to me doing this and knew what I was up to, but the others just seemed a little puzzled. I'm not sure, I said absentmindedly. I can't do big magic, so the best I can do is make a tiny knife. I was still focused on his bow, and I reached out and touched it. I wanted to feel the difference between the fuzzy and the focused parts. Careful, he explained and jerked his bow away. Then he hurriedly unsummoned. Don't ever do that. Are you okay? Sorry, I said quickly and jerked my hand back. I'm fine. Is your bow okay? Of course it's okay, he says. You can't hurt my bow. And I'm sure. Are you really sure you're all right? He seemed very concerned, but I wasn't sure why he should be. I looked over at Sandy, and she seemed concerned too. "I feel fine," I said. "Am I missing something?" He breathed a sigh of relief. "I must have jerked it away in time," he said. "Good. You have to be very careful around magic weapons." He gave me a stern look. "They are concentrated magical energy, and touching them can burn your body and really mess with your natural energy. That's why everyone fights weapon against weapons, or uses their shields to block attacks. Think of them like lightsabers. You wouldn't just grab a lightsaber with your bare hands." I nodded quickly. "Got it. Thanks for letting me know. I'll be extra careful from now on." "Well, isn't that just a tasty piece of information?" my analytical side said in his best Sherlock Holmes voice. "We need to talk this over tonight. For now, be sure and ask him about shields." I wasn't sure where he was going with this, but I was willing to play along. "Tell me about shields in the tournament," I said. "It seemed like fighters have a shield charm, and then when that pops, or when that poops out, they make their own." Eugene gave me a look that let me know that he knew I was changing the conversation, but he was willing to go along with it. "That's correct. Fighters are allowed one shield charm, and pretty much everyone uses the same style. Only the really rich and powerful fighters can buy a custom-made shield charm, and even then, it might not be that good. From what I understand, the inner workings of shield charms are a lost art. There is one good stable pattern and everybody uses that. The only difference is what the charm is made of and how much capacity it has. The shield charm protects you as much as it can, and when it runs out of juice, it's up to you to make your own. Obviously, that's hard to do in the middle of a fight. So the time between when your shield charm goes down and your personal shield forms up is the biggest window of opportunity for your opponent to quickly end the match." "That makes sense," I said. "But why don't fighters pre-summon their shield inside of the shield charm? That way, when the charm fails, their personal one's ready to go." "You can't." Eugene shook his head. "It interferes with the shield charm. The charm is there to protect your physical body, and when a mage throws up their shield around it, the charm can no longer sense your body, so it shuts down. Fighters have tried to get around this by foregoing the shield charm entirely and making their own shield from the jump. But that just takes a lot of flow right when you're trying to form your weapon. Plus, the fighter will roll down much faster as they are powering both the shield and the weapon from the start of the fight. A few mages here and there still try it, but nobody sticks with that strategy for long." Now it was time for the million-dollar question. "So, how do you form your own shield?" I asked. This could be the answer I'd been searching for. Ever since Isabella kicked the crap out of me, I've been trying not to let that happen again by getting a shield. I couldn't use charms, so that was out. Sandy used fire for everything, so she couldn't teach me, and Annabeth didn't know either. All my defense up to this point had come from Tyler. I used his pitching, stepping, and blocking to avoid attacks, but that wasn't the same thing as having a shield. "The idea is pretty simple, really," Eugene said. "You just layer your magic around your body like armor. The execution is a lot harder. You have to pay attention to your whole body, form the magic, force it into place, then remember to renew it. It's much harder than it sounds." "I'm sure it is," I said. "That sounds like a lot to keep track of." "It is," Eugene said seriously, "and if you miss a spot, you don't have any protection. I spent a long time working on mine. My teacher told everybody in the school to hit me every time they saw me, and they were to hit me in every area they could reach to make sure I had full coverage. As you can imagine, I got really good with my shield really quickly." Once again, this sounded like stupid male hazing, but apparently that was a great learning tool. Meanwhile, I'd gotten the answer I wanted. Now it seemed so simple, I wondered how I'd missed it. I discovered magic works best with imagination and intention. If I wanted a shield, I just needed the right imagination and intention to make it happen. Best of all, my magic worked in close, and that's where a shield needed to be. I wanted to smack myself on the forehead. I'd gotten so hung up on shield charms, and the fact I couldn't use them, I'd never gone beyond that. Now I just needed to figure out how to make a shield. "You already have one," my analytical side said smugly. "Huh?" I said intelligently. Gem cells, he said in his best British voice. Your gem cells are your shield. Oh, I can't do a British voice. And you've already been using them that way. He got a self-satisfied look on his face and waited for me to catch up. Eugene hadn't moved his bow in time. I touched it, and it hadn't hurt me at all. That's because I had my gem cell gauntlets on. Come to think of it, I'd already been blocking magic with my hands back when I'd had my fight with Big Ugly and his crew. I'd blocked a sword strike, and then I'd forgotten about it with everything else that had happened. When I thought of a shield, I thought of one solid layer of magic covering me and protecting me. That had thrown me off because my creations have to be small, no more than 3 inches. With the gem cells, it was perfect because they were little small creations that linked together to create a much larger area of coverage. They just covered my hands and forearms at the moment, but they could cover so much more. I'm going to have a shield, I squealed in excitement. You're going to have a shield, he squealed back. We linked arms and danced around each other in happiness, like we were doing the wedding scene in Fiddler on the Roof. Then my analytical side stopped, and his eyes twinkled. We've waited for this so long, I think it's Eureka time. My analytical side was usually so posh and British. This was really cutting loose for him, but I loved it. Eureka, I hollered, and just like that old Greek guy Archimedes, we tore off our clothes and ran through ancient city streets screaming at the top of our lungs, Eureka! Eureka! My imaginary people looked at us like we were crazy, but we didn't care. Jason? MM shook me gently. Earth to Jason. I realized I'd been standing there, staring off to space, grinning maniacally for several moments. That wasn't a good look, but inside my head it had been party time. Oh, sorry, I said quickly. I was just figuring something out. Don't worry, don't mind me. I'll work it out later. I smiled like normal and tried to focus on what was going on, but all I wanted to do was run back to my room and get started growing my shield. Finally, I was going to have some real defense. The tournament was still going on, and this was an amazing place to see and learn from other fighters. I wasn't going to be around something like this again for a long time. There were mages of all types and talents fighting with their best techniques, and I had the vision to pick it all apart. This was the only night we would have available to visit the tournament, so I needed to snap out of it and really pay attention. Eugene, Sandy, I had an idea for a shield, and I'm really interested in learning all I can. I've been enjoying this evening as a regular spectator, but I'd like to kick it up to really high gear and start seeing how the mages are doing things. Can you help me? Of course. Sandy was a battle mage. She loved a good fight, and she loved learning new things. She'd have helped me anyway, but this was right up her alley. Certainly, Eugene said seriously. Then he looked at Sandy with a twinkle in his eye. I think we may have created a monster. As long as he's our monster, Sandy replied with a laugh. And so we got to work. We did our best to get as close to the fighters as possible so I could use my magic sight. I reported back what I was seeing, and we all discussed the abilities of the mage, their possible training, and what they could have done better. I kept everything focused on the contestants and didn't mention my abilities, but Eugene was still surprised at how well I could see magic. I didn't mention my magic sight. I just made it seem like I was looking with my regular eyes. Of course, they could see magic very well too, so it wasn't a lie. It quickly became clear that most mages were forcing their magic into shapes. Their weapons and shields were serviceable, but they weren't inspired. They weren't related to their magic, and in return, they weren't relating to their magic. In return, it wasn't helping them. It was just a thing to them, like Play-Doh, and they pounded it into whatever shape they needed. Not all mages were like this, though. There were a few that were magic craftsmen. One mage in particular was just fantastic. He didn't look special at all until the match started. Then he formed a short sword and a round shield that made me sit up and take notice. His sword was detailed, sharp, and held a crap ton of magic. His shield looked like the one Captain America used, and it felt so solid and crisp. The match started and his opponent summoned a magic staff. That was good, but not great. They were fighting in an open ring, so they quickly closed and exchanged blows. I saw then just what having a good weapon could do for a fighter, as his sword was destroying his opponent's staff. He was literally knocking the magic right out of it, and his opponent was having to refill and refocus his weapon. It wasn't just his sword either. His round shield was doing the same type of damage. A light bulb of inspiration went off in my head. I thought the attacker always had the advantage, I said, but really every interaction between magical weapons uses up a bit of magic from both fighters, right? That is true, Eugene said, but it isn't a big factor in the fight, as it affects both fighters equally. I suppose if one mage had a very low capacity and one mage had very high capacity, the high capacity mage could win by dragging out the fight. But that would take a long time, and it would be very boring. What I was seeing play out in front of me didn't support Eugene's view at all. As I watched the fight, I saw the craftsman wasn't really attacking the staff man directly. Instead, he was focusing everything on the weapon, and it wasn't long before staff man had to make changes. He tried to get fancy by making his staff elongate for a semi-ranged attack, but it was easily blocked by the craftsman's round shield. Then he lost so much capacity in his weapon, he had to make it shorter, much shorter, and that's when the craftsman went to work. He slammed his round shield against the craftsman's shield charm shield, and it buzzed, flared, and fell away. Question, I said quickly. Does the size of the weapon matter as to how much magic it costs the mage to fight with? It would take more magic to fill a larger weapon, Eugene said. That's why you don't see big handheld shields. It takes too much power for something like a tower shield. That makes sense, I replied. That isn't what I meant to ask, though. Does the area of interaction between the two weapons matter as to how much magic it takes from both parties? Eugene just looked confused, but Sandy jumped in. Are you asking if two magic swords that clash on the edges of the blades cost less magic drain than two swords that hit against the flats of the blade? The flat part obviously has more surface area. Yes, that's exactly it, I said. She looked at Eugene first. He was our tournament winner after all, as well as the oldest mage here. I don't think it does. He shrugged and dismissed the question. I think it might, Sandy said, but I'm not sure. On one hand, more magic is clashing, so it seems like it would take more out of both fighters. On the other hand, using the match we're watching, it would take more magic for the staff to remain whole if the sword strikes with the edge, just like in real life where a steel sword would cut off the end of a staff. That was actually a great analogy, even better than she knew. Staff Man had a mediocre weapon, so it was like he was fighting with wood. The craftsman, on the other hand, seemed like he was fighting with steel. The fight was still going, which was curious, as I'm sure the craftsman could have ended the match at any time. He seemed relaxed, confident, and in total control, unlike his opponent who was sweating. The only thing I could think of was the craftsman didn't want to end the match too quickly and give away just how good he was. It's always better to be underestimated after all. The craftsman had let Staffman get his personal shield up, but he was having trouble sourcing both that and his weapon. His shield was solid but nothing special. Eugene liked some of his staff moves and really thought he had a chance, but I knew he was toast. Finally, the craftsman decided to end it, and he slammed his round shield against Staffman's personal shield. It flared, sparked, and Staffman fell back with a gasp. It looked like it had really hurt. If my theory about surface area held true, then the craftsman's round shield was causing a lot more hurt than a sword strike would. The craftsman hit Staffman's weapon, knocking it out of the way, and he whacked shields again. This time Staffman's personal shield fell, which threw off his concentration, and his staff vanished. He quickly threw himself on the ground. Yield, he hollered, and the match was over. Eugene kept talking about their weapon technique and the disadvantage of using a handheld shield, but I knew better. I'd seen a whole other way of winning a match, one that suited my talents and my attention to detail. That was almost as exciting as figuring out my own personal shield. Almost. Getting my own shield was a big deal. A huge, awesome deal. I couldn't wait to get all naked Eureka again. Oh, I didn't want to get all naked Eureka again, so I tried not to get too excited. I wanted to talk to the craftsman, but as soon as the walls dropped, he was surrounded by enthusiastic congratulations from his house. Then they hurried off to do something else. I made a mental snapshot of his face and stuck it on my memory board. Maybe I'd see him around later. And this ends the chapter. I will see you guys next time when he makes his own personal shield. Or tries to anyway. Alright. See you next week.